Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. If you listen carefully to my colleague on the opposite side of the aisle, Mr. Luetkemeyer, you would think that the major point of this bill is the choke point controversy. Considerable time was spent by my colleague on the opposite side of the aisle talking about choke point. Well, I do not want that discussion to obscure the real problem with this very bad legislation. H.R. 766 eliminates core provisions of the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery and Enforcement Act, or FIRREA, that the Justice Department has used to investigate and prosecute bank fraud. And this is what this discussion should be about: bank fraud. FIRREA has proven to be the Justice Department's most effective tool for holding Wall Street accountable. We hear a lot of talk about Wall Street. We went through 2008 and the subprime meltdown and the bailout and all of that. And most of the members on both sides of the aisle agree that we had to rein in the practices of Wall Street. And here we have a bill today that would basically protect them and take away the very tool that is used in order to make them accountable. After using FIRREA to secure historic settlements against Wall Street, including a $7 billion settlement against Citibank, a $5 billion settlement against Goldman Sachs, a $13 billion settlement against J.P. Morgan Chase, and a historic $16 billion settlement against Bank of America. Now, H.R. 766 seeks to stifle the Justice Department's investigative powers over financial fraud. In fact, there are still ongoing settlement negotiations with banks like Wells Fargo and Goldman Sachs that were announced just this week. Without investigatory powers and extended statute of limitations granted to the Justice Department by FIRREA, it would be impossible for us to identify and rectify the fraudulent activity that set us up for a crisis 10 years ago. Apparently, H.R. 766 supporters believe that actually holding banks for fraud was too much of a burden for them, replacing our system of too big to jail. With one where our biggest banks are now too frail to fine, H.R. 766 also invites the next crisis by imposing burdensome requirements. Listen at this: imposing burdensome requirements on the Justice Department's ability to investigate bank fraud, allowing fraud schemes to continue at the expense of consumers and the financial system. The Justice Department's ability to identify and root out fraud would be critical in averting future crises, and H.R. 766 would be a free pass to banks that make their money by breaking the law. That would include banks like Plaza, Commerce West, and Four Oaks, all of whom knowingly aided fraudsters, despite the many red flags raised by their financial activities. At Commerce West, in particular, the bank admitted fraud for failing to file suspicious activity reports with regulators even after the bank's own employees determined that one of their customers was routinely submitting fraudulent checks to the bank. According to the Justice Department's complaint, the bank also failed to heed the warning of other banks that pointed out to Commerce West that some of their customers were fraudulent businesses. Furthermore, H.R. 766 account closure provisions are a solution in search of a problem, as regulators are not forcing financial institutions to close customer accounts. Every federal banking regulator has been clear, except for rare cases involving national security or systemic risk, Responsibility for closing accounts is a decision for financial institutions. Some financial institutions are simply deciding that they would rather lose a customer than invest in the resources needed to ensure that our financial system is not being used for money laundering or other criminal activity. In order to protect our economy from the next financial crisis, regulators have to have the necessary tools to prevent fraud and protect consumers. Americans are still reeling from the effects of the financial crisis, and we should be in the business of seeking ways to continue to hold banks more accountable for their misconduct, not rolling back the federal government's most effective tool for protecting consumers, investors, and taxpayers from bank fraud. Banks that break the law don't deserve get-out-of-jail-free card. The administration will veto H.R. 766, and so I'm going to urge my Democratic colleagues to oppose H.R. 766. And I just want to say that despite yesterday, we had 5 basically bills that had been rolled into one that I warned our members of Congress about because of what they literally did, particularly in terms of allowing corporations to not have to disclose information about the contracts that they were giving to not the bonuses or the contracts, but simply about the what? The stock, I'm sorry, about the stock that they were given to their employees. And I talked about how bad that was. This is worse. This is worse because we're able to call names and to point out banks because we have the information. It's real. We're able to point out how the Justice Department is effective in making these banks accountable. So why in the world would we want to take away the Justice Department's tool that is FIREA? Why would we want to prevent the Justice Department from going after these banks who know they're dealing with crooks and fraudsters? And so I would